Welcome to another episode of As One Voice, the podcast for veterans, about veterans, by veterans, and trying to report on all things that is VA related. I want to update everybody on some articles that have breached the headlines over the past week and a half. I originally recorded one last week, but I didn't publish it because I had gotten pretty fired up from some of the information that I was putting out and didn't feel it was doing the article fair justice because of how fired up it had actually made me. So Fox News had actually reported of an Army Ranger congressman who was actually using VA facilities. He had an office, an agreement with the VA hospital to have an office. This was in 2 locations in Florida. And that way he could actually have quick access to his constituents. And now he shared that office with 5 other politicians as well. But now all of a sudden the VA's booting him, and the VA hospital initially had come out saying that they needed the space for smoking cessation classes, which have been around for a very long time anyway, so I highly doubt they were going to use that small space for that use, but it is what it is. And the politicians are up in arms, stating that this is retaliation for the Q&A that they did during the committee hearings against the VA. The VA, in turn, says the VA hospital is used for treating veterans and that the politicians have their own offices in their community for their constituents to have full access of them. So the VA secretary is standing behind their decision to boot these politicians out of that space. Now, for the average civilian that hears that will turn around and think that that's no big deal. However, us veterans, the first thing that comes to mind is, what are they trying to hide? What's the VA hiding that they don't want their politicians to be located in the hospital for quick and easy access? Another article from the Post and Courier that was published about something that occurred in South Carolina in 2017. A lot of veterans probably forget about this. Some veterans probably remember this, but there's a reason why this is recently published again, brought to the public's attention. But the article is regarding a veteran in South Carolina in 2017, a 37-year-old veteran who had been diagnosed with a personality disorder, and it was deemed that he should not be around others. And he went to a VA waiting room, and then he jumped on another veteran. That's where the hospital staff tackled the veteran, and his name was Luke Smith, and wrestled him to the floor. A staff member put Smith in a chokehold, thrown him to the floor while the other staff member sat on his back. And Smith thrashed around until the staff kept holding on, and until finally, after 10 minutes, Smith was actually dead. So they tried to do CPR to revive him. It was too late. Smith's family is suing the VA, stating that Smith was supposed to be isolated and not around others as deemed by a professional. And if he had been isolated, then he would still be alive today. Now, of course, the VA is going to come out with a statement saying that they can't comment on an ongoing investigation, but then they'll praise that facility and the quality it delivers to the veterans. But early in this year, 2019, on the 22nd of January, a 35-year-old veteran named William Avant was a patient at the State Department of Health and was also killed in a restraining incident in Columbia, South Carolina. So finally, this article highlights that they identified almost 9,700 appointments completed at the Dorn Center in Columbia between a 6-month period that failed to meet the VA's timeline standard, as well as a quarter of those veterans had to endure wait time longer than 61 days. And that was from a 2015 report. So this highlights that there are still facilities out there that are operating in a shady manner, which doesn't benefit the veteran at all. But the VA will keep supporting their veteran facilities, or their VA facilities, and state that they're remaining transparent and their only purpose in life is to help veterans out. Unfortunately, over the past handful of weeks, the VA has been burning up the headlines and still not getting national attention, which is piss poor. It's also what fires me up. So I'm going to try to maintain a level head here while I go over a couple more articles. The publication IJR reported that Secretary Wilkie defended the decision to evict the representative, who was the Republican Brian Mast from Florida. The other 5 Congress members were Democrats from Florida, and they were sharing the space. This is where they were trying to be there for constituents. So Secretary Wilkie is quoted as saying, "To be clear, under this administration, the department is more transparent and accountable than ever before. Since President Trump's inauguration, the VA became the first hospital system in the nation to post online our wait times, opioid prescription rates, and chief executive travel," end quote. So Wilkie is living by the VA mantra of, if you say it, people will believe it. So how are we going to trust the information being published on any VA site? And how do we know it hasn't been manipulated like previous wait times, like the Phoenix VA wait times, and then the current processing timeframes? And the bottom line is veterans can't trust that. All it is lip service to try to sate everybody from maintaining their attention on that subject. ConnectingVets.radio reports that U.S. Senate has passed a TSA pre-check for veterans bill. And I would like to highlight how quick this bill was passed through the Senate. Now, some bills do take a long time because of the amendments and the across the aisle infighting and who wants this word changed to this and so on and so forth. But this bill, this TSA bill, was to allow veterans who had prosthetics or had other disabilities to allow them to do their pre-check, and that way they can bypass the pat-down and the scanners. Now, I find it funny that some of these bills that pass so rapidly are happening as quick as they are during re-election season. It's not funny, it's actually sad, because those that don't see exactly why these certain promises are happening, then you're living in a cave for sure. Because I've got another article that came up regarding the demands that a politician was making and how he's going to make sure that veterans aren't abused any longer and this never happens again, and he's soon to retire. So once again, there's nothing he's going to be able to do prior to his retirement, and he's only saying that to either support the party he belongs to or to make it look like he's actually done something while in office. Remember, some of these politicians have been in office for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, collecting over $174,000 per year as their salary, not to include the $3 million that they get every year for staff and for travel. So just keep that in mind when you start feeling sorry for some of these politicians. Start comparing what their accomplishments have been while they've been in office. So the Air Force veteran who was covered in ants, this story's come up a couple times. The periodical IJR reported that the chairman of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs is mad about the report on the Air Force veteran who was covered in ants and was bitten over 100 times while he was in a VA hospital. Well, he was in a VA care facility. So some may cheer that finally a politician is shaking his fist in the air and demanding the VA do a better job. But however, before you throw a parade for this guy, it's probably a good idea to understand that Senator Isaacson, who's a Republican from Georgia, is retiring from politics very soon. So what this means is he may sound like he's going to make things happen and that he cares about veterans, but he's leaving office. So there's nothing he's going to be able to do. Nothing he's going to do. So that way it's on the record that he made a promise and he cares for his veterans. So that topic is going to end up disappearing and just fall to the wayside while others take its place. So some of these politicians, they have a habit of, taking a stand when it comes up for re-election, when they come up for re-election, or they needed to gain the veteran vote in their area. It's sickening is what it is, because it makes it look like society is so stupid that they're not paying attention to false promises, which, by the way, is an epidemic at this point in the news with the election, the presidential elections coming up. So just remember that proof is in the pudding. In other words, if they made a promise, follow up and see exactly if they followed up on that promise. What have they done to date to support what they're now demanding be done? In other words, if they're fighting that veterans shouldn't be treated like this, well, what pro-veteran bills have they passed? What actions have they taken to hold the VA accountable for killing veterans, for allowing drunk doctors to misdiagnose veterans, for allowing directors who were caught and exposed for manipulating the numbers to make it look like their facility was doing more business with veterans? What have they done? If your answer is nothing, then that's exactly what they're also doing for you. So think about that when you're at the polls. The periodical My Suncoast published an article explaining how Bernie Sanders had a veteran hand him a $139,000 medical bill, stating that he had Huntington's syndrome and that he'd been kicked off of TRICARE. So a lot of these articles that I'm seeing are very biased, and by biased I mean they are manipulating the information to make it look like somebody's a hero and it's not that big of a deal. So it's important for civilians to understand that TRICARE is for those who have retired from the military or their family. And that's it. The average civilian is not getting TRICARE medical insurance. It's not going to happen. They're not going to go see a doctor on TRICARE because they're not eligible. So that being said, this veteran stating that he got kicked off of TRICARE and now he has a $139,000 bill from the medical facility because he got kicked out of TRICARE. So it doesn't expound on why he got kicked out of TRICARE. I have no idea why he got kicked out, but Bernie Sanders was there doing his speech and doing his community, whatever it was, where it was a Q&A to try to support his bid for president. of the United States. And this guy, this veteran, tells Bernie Sanders that he can't take care of himself and he's going to kill himself. And Bernie Sanders looks at him and says, quote, "Don't, period, hold it, John, period, stop it, period. You're not going to kill yourself. Stop it," end quote. So the veteran answers back asking Bernie Sanders if he knows what it's like to live with that disease. And Bernie Sanders' answers was, quote, "All right, let's chat later at the end of the meeting, okay?" And then he goes on to push his platform of how it's important for universal health care and doesn't approach anything when it comes to that topic of this veteran. Puts this guy off to the side until the end of his little, whatever it was, community speech and Q&A session, and doesn't approach why he got kicked off of TRICARE and why it was that he felt it was necessary to push this veteran off to the side and tell him, we'll talk to it later. The veteran just acknowledged that he wanted to kill himself because he couldn't take it anymore. He can barely do anything for himself, and now he's facing a $139,000 bill from the healthcare facility. And all Bernie Sanders did was use that as his segue into pushing universal health care. Once again, anybody that thinks you're going to get free health care without somebody having to pay for it, you're a fool. You're absolutely a fool, and you need to rethink your decisions in life, because you make it painful for everybody else to survive. Somebody has to pay. That's just how it is. So universal health care, free college, it's not free college because somebody has to fund it. And if you think that free is good, you start looking at other countries who thought the same thing, who are now desperately trying to get bailed out of their situation. So the fact that Bernie Sanders pushed the veteran off to the side, not because of the $139,000 bill, the mere fact that the veteran said he wanted to die, he wanted to kill himself, at that point there, I'm pretty sure the audience would have understood if he had said, you know what, we're going to take 10 minutes before I start our little Q&A session. I want to talk to this veteran off to the side. But instead had that dialogue in front of everybody rather than taking this veteran off to the side. Nothing got accomplished other than giving Bernie Sanders the segue into pushing his agenda of free healthcare. So once again, look at what these politicians are saying. Look at what they've done. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I don't know enough of him to gain too much of an opinion other than he's been a politician for 50 years. And in those 50 years, list the accomplishments and why is it not more? See, that's the thing, is I don't understand how some politicians can live with themselves by taking such a high paycheck. Because remember, if they're minority or majority in the House, they get even more money. They get an extra $20,000 a year. So that upon the other donations, wink, wink, that they receive, start looking at their net worth. And you can Google that because the updated net worth for the 115th Congress has been published. You start looking at what their net worth is and start asking yourself, what made them rich? Because you shouldn't get rich as a politician. You should be rich, sure, absolutely. Fight for your money and go into politics when you are rich. That way you don't really have to worry about money. That's awesome. And a lot of politicians do that. They come into office and they're already pretty wealthy. And then, they earn their $174,000 plus each year. And it's going to make them even richer, but it's not going to make them millions of dollars richer like some of the politicians are today. So think about that and put things into perspective. You can like who you want to like. You can support who you want to support. But don't cry the victim when your politician that you elected into office turns around and screws you over, because I've got no sympathy for you at that point there. So another article, the Daily Advocate published the article on Senator Sherrod Brown, who's a Democrat in Ohio. She's a Senate VA committee member, joining the other politicians asking if the VA to expand the list of chronic health care conditions for those exposed to Agent Orange. Keep in mind, we're in 2019, folks. Agent Orange, Vietnam veterans. So now this senator sent a letter to the secretary explaining the need for the VA to expand the list of possible conditions those who were exposed to Agent Orange could have. And the letter is worded well and comes off as strong, but it's just that, it's a letter. It's another piece of correspondence for politicians to use to show that they support the veteran community, and another thing to be filed under keep on delaying this in the VA's file cabinet. We'll have to see exactly how much effort is given to hold the VA accountable and keep the pressure on them. But my guess is the letter is about as strong as it's going to get, and it doesn't make me laugh. I do find it odd that these politicians will will quickly jump in front of a microphone and state that they've written a strong letter to the VA and they demand answers, but you don't ever get a follow-up answer on that or any actions that they've been doing. I'm actually sick and tired of that garbage. The Washington Examiner published an article pushing blame on Trump instead of where the blame should actually belong. Richard Stone, who served under the Obama administration as head of the Veterans Health Administration, VHA, remained in place and was in leadership position when he, let me repeat that, when he purged 270,000 pending veteran applications. So people are trying to blame Trump that 250,000 veteran applications got shredded when it was the head of the VHA who was Richard Stone. So let that sink in just for a little bit, because the article is going to try to push the blame on Trump. And if you read the article, which I highly suggest, just so you can get an idea of how those periodicals are using their platform to convince readers what they want them to believe, because that's what's happening in the mainstream media and social media, and people are falling for it. They're mindless drones that are, yes, we must believe like this, and then they'll go fight and picket and scream and yell, but then when they're asked questions, do not have an answer. They just get mad and scream even louder, because that's what people do in society today. If they don't like what you have to say, but they don't have a good rebuttal, they'll sit there and scream and yell and call you a racist or a white supremacist or whatever the popular phrase is today to get you to shut up so they can walk away feeling victorious that they just beat you in that argument. But there's plenty of videos out there now where great questions are asked and these people cannot honestly answer because they don't know. So then they're asked, how are you fighting for something if you don't know exactly what it is or what's been done? And they turn around and walk away and scream and yell, this is done. I don't want you videoing me anymore. And it's happening in universities, and it's allowed in universities. So let that thing sink in. You're paying a lot of money for an education or for your child's education only for them to be manipulated and mind screwed, so that way they're gonna scream and yell that things are unfair and they demand change, but they're not willing to put forth the effort. They'll skip a school day so they can picket something. And ironically enough, in the news recently, it was the climate control or global warming or environment something or other. And those that were sitting there and had their own little picket signs going and screaming and yelling about it's unfair as they're playing on their iPhones and leaving a park full of trash. But yet they're screaming and yelling about save our planet. It makes zero sense whatsoever. Some days I think I'm losing my mind because of it. So the blame lies in the so-called leaders in the VA and the actions that they have done. 270,000 applications were shredded. That's inexcusable. Another story years ago about the VA worker that, for whatever reason, I think a whistleblower turned him in. The federal agents go to a storage facility, open up the garage door, and it's nothing but thousands upon thousands of veterans' records and appeals and applications for disability. And you don't hear anything about what the repercussions were, or the VA workers that were forced to shred VA medical records of veterans. You heard nothing about that. You didn't hear anybody getting fired. You didn't hear about VA leaders being replaced. The VA likes to retire or relocate those that are exposed. They don't fire them. And I've heard it before where politicians and others and the VA says, you don't know how hard it is to fire a federal employee. Well, guess what? That's what we got politicians for, to pass laws that make it easier. And it was a couple of years ago that it was passed for the VA to have that ability to fire employees. Now, I want you to keep that in mind because there's more articles coming. And in those articles, veterans are dying and have been abused while the leaders get relocated or put on admin leave, which is paid, by the way. So not only did they hurt veterans, but now they're put on a paid vacation that doesn't count as vacation while the investigation occurs. And this happens constantly. You don't hear about it because it's not going to hit the mainstream media. No, they're too busy manipulating the data so you can be convinced of something else. So Military Times outlines why the VA's current suicide strategy will fail and highlights how the VA, which is a $220 billion annual budget organization, should not outsource some of their current steps that they're using right now. Another article that came up on MSN reports the U.S. senators today are paid a salary of $174,000 per year, which is triple the average American's household earnings, with the Senate majority and minority leaders making even more at $193,400 annually, but it doesn't include benefits as travel and staff allowances, which averages $3 million per year. So it's nice to know that while veterans struggle each day, week, month, year, our political representatives in D.C. can get nice and fat off their paycheck. And some may say, well, we earned it because we're in DC making decisions. No, you're in DC riding that gravy train is what you're doing. And that's for a majority of them. There are some good politicians that refuse to bend to popular thought and opinion up there in DC, which is good for them. However, you'll notice that these are very few and far between, and they don't tend to have a lucrative career in politics. So I think every politician should have to use VA care, and they should have to use the VA care in their state, in their community, and then watch how good the VA care gets. Because I'm telling you right now, the care that they get, because some of them, I've heard politicians say on interviews that they use VA care in DC and it's the greatest care ever. And I guarantee you it is not the same care that the average veteran gets. So any veteran that thinks that you get the same care and treatment that a politician does, then you probably need to rethink your medication because it's affecting your brain for sure. So the 116th Congress, which is what they're in now, in 2020 their net worth will show up. But if you Google the net worth of politicians, 115th Congress, and look at what their net worth is for each politician, you'll be amazed to see how much they're worth now versus from when they entered office. And like I said, some of them entered office being pretty wealthy, and that's great. However, if their net worth goes from $500,000 to $15 million in the course of a couple years, there's a problem. They're getting money from somewhere for something. And if you think it's for good things, then once again, get your medications checked. So the Sanford Health, an organization that gleefully accepted Dr. David Shulkin into their embrace as their chief innovation officer and on the international board, these folks, after seeing exactly what was done when he was secretary of the VA before Trump fired him, this organization, which is a global organization, quickly snatched him up. So it shows you that you can literally screw over a nation full of veterans, and some organization is going to hire you up. And right there should show you exactly what their ethical guidelines are and where they stand morally, because he is now a key player in that organization, and this organization has a global reach. So instead of a national one, it's global. So that means he gets to affect the health and welfare across the globe. 11 Alive reports that the director of the VA home where the Air Force veteran was covered in ants twice and was the director was put on administrative leave. So he's still getting paid. And a handful of other staff members were moved into positions where they will not interact with patients while the investigation is ongoing. So the possible staff who possibly had a hand in neglect and abuse of this veteran are put in another position where they're not handling veterans. However, they're still getting the same pay. So they'll never get a reduction in pay because that's not what the VA does. The VA will move them to another location and give them the same pay. And if they have to relocate them, the VA will pay their relocation fees. So that's nice to know. You can kill a veteran and still keep your job. So this whole debacle occurred at the Atlanta VA Medical Center's Eagles Nest Community Living Care. The 2 top administrators and 7 staffers were removed from their position, but key in that they still currently have a job. This man's daughter tells 11 Alive that the staff told her that they walked into her father's room and he was covered in ants, and then told her that they thought he was dead. The staff stated they tried to clear away the ants, but they just came back the next day and covered this veteran again. Okay, so I'm not a bug guy. However, I can tell you that ants have a pattern and they're food oriented, so they're always going to try to find food. The scouts go out, find the foods, leave a scent trail for the other ants to come and help get a whole bunch of food so they can bring it back to the colony and feed the colony. It doesn't take rocket science. You know, you watch the Science Channel or Bill Nye the Science Guy, whatever. It's out there. You can actually Google it. You can go on YouTube and actually watch videos. So in order for the scent trail to remain, that means something wasn't washed. The room wasn't cleaned because the scent trail remained for the ants to come back and cover this this veteran, who was dying of cancer, by the way, who did die of cancer, actually. So knowing this, I'd be curious as to how often his linen was changed, how often he was cleaned, how often the staff was actually in his room, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's not that hard. I'm not even an investigator, and I already have a checklist of what I would want to check to remove the possible cancerous staff who are there, so that way they don't impact other veterans who rely on them to provide them with medication, cleanliness, exercise, and so on and so forth for their last final days. So this really fired me up. It makes me sick. So if it was properly cleaned, I mean, think about it. If there was a room infested with ants, one, you'd relocate the patient. Two, you'd contact maintenance to come in and actually find out where the ants are coming from and caulk the hole, or call somebody to come in and fumigate it, a pest control professional, whatever. But this wouldn't have taken that long to where the guy was covered twice, and he was covered in over 100 bites. So then they finally moved him, and that's when he ended up dying, because he was dying of cancer anyway. So his last days were miserable, and he had to be dealt with by staff that didn't care. That seriously, that fires me up. That really pisses me off. So the Daily Dots writer, David Gilmour, who has a Twitter account where you must be accepted before allowed to follow, he works pretty hard at his article at spinning a tweet that Dan Crenshaw had tweeted regarding Bernie Sanders and Bernie's take on veterans health care. So let's not forget that Bernie sat on the seat of Senate VA committee chair. And so he wasn't the chairman, but he was on the VA committee. And that he panders to everyone by saying what he feels will get him more votes, like every other politician. So I don't dog him on that, because every politician does that. However, I'm not even going to call him a writer, but the guy that did write this article, he spins the article to make it look like Dan Crenshaw is just this complete moron who is trying to ping on Bernie Sanders, when Dan Crenshaw lost his eye in combat while he was a Navy SEAL. So that doesn't give him accolades, though. That doesn't mean he's a great politician. No, don't get me wrong. Just because he got injured in combat, just because he was a Navy SEAL, doesn't make him a great politician or a fighter in D.C., okay? So each politician should be weighed on what they advance, how they better their community, and what they do while they're in office to help their constituents. That's what they need to be looked at for. So it bugs me that these rags is what they are. I mean, there's just so many out there, and they're all doing the same thing. They're all trying to spin it so that way you believe a certain narrative. So this is why it's important to actually research the information and look up some of these stories and then research the facts behind them. So Crenshaw had tweeted that Bernie panders to different groups, and ended the tweet by saying, I didn't go to war so you would take care of me, Bernie. I went because I wanted to serve and our country needed it. And this is after Bernie tweeted, quote, if you can't afford to take care of your veterans, then don't go to war, end quote. So Bernie Sanders, who sits on the Senate VA committee, is commenting that the U.S. is not taking care of its vet appropriately. But what exactly is he continuing to do to help veterans? 50 years, mind you, 50 years. Now look at what he's done for veterans. Because I got to tell you, we wouldn't be having the conversation regarding Agent Orange today if things were put in place when they should have. Soon as it was realized that Agent Orange was a poison and that service members were dying and they were getting cancers and they were getting other maladies because of it, immediately it should have been looked at and then researched by the VA and then covered for the veterans. But instead, we're discussing it now in 2019. So that once again fires me up. So it seems that a politician who's been in office for 50 years would have found a way to hold the VA accountable for poor care of veterans. However, that doesn't seem the case. So what has Bernie said about the serial killings of the veterans in West Virginia, or the drunk doctor who remained employed by the VA after the VA gave him a couple warnings and is the cause of some 3,000 misdiagnoses and 15 deaths? Or what about veteran homelessness, or vet suicides, or vet joblessness, or the VA doctor that's doing sexual assaults, or the veteran who died after being covered with ants twice in a VA facility before he died of cancer? So this is what fires me up, is that people are allowed, and it's their freedom of speech. They have that. First Amendment covers them on that, and they will use that platform to convince everybody to think a certain way, which, that's the same way with books. It's the same thing, to get you to think a certain way. But it's up to you to actually pursue the truth. And if you're too lazy to pursue the truth, then you have no right to sit there and complain about anything, because there are solutions that are at your disposal if you pursue them. And if you don't, well, then that's on you. So the West Virginia Record posted an article explaining how now 5 families who have had their veteran family member killed at a VA facility, this is in West Virginia, by being injected with insulin when they were not diabetics, are being represented by the same attorney or the law firm. So the Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat, who is from that area, I mean, that's his district, was quick to demand an investigation into the matter now. However, it is wise to point out that in 2018, it was found that one of the veterans' remains were dug up and tested, and that they were killed by insulin injection. So in 2018, this is when flags should have been flown. There should have been an immediate investigation and an independent investigation committee that would actually reach out to other veterans who died during the same time frame to get the request to exhume the bodies, to figure out if this is one problem or multiple problems. So also key in the story is that the politician stated, quote, "Today I made sure to talk to Secretary Wilkie and Dr. Schneider to make sure that their investigation into these deaths is accurate and thorough. I was also assured by both Secretary Wilkie and Dr. Schneider that the person of interest is no longer in contact with veterans at the VA facility," end quote. So the kicker is at the end of the article, where the politician states, quote, "As a member of the Senate VA Veterans Affairs Committee, I will do everything in my power to investigate these accusations and get to the bottom of what happened. These families and loved ones deserve answers as soon as possible, and I will make sure that they get them," end quote. Now, the average reader will read that and probably think, hey, this politician is veteran friendly. But if you reread the article, especially the last paragraph, it states that he is a member of the Senate VA committee. Notice that a name has not been announced regarding who the person of interest was, which I am hopeful that it will be published once charges are pressed. However, there is more than one person at play here in these deaths, and this is an important, and it was published previously that the insulin was leftover medication left on the cart in the hallway. But nobody's talking about that part anymore. You see how they start compiling other information and other quotes and other demands. So other information that was previously mentioned just kind of disappears. So funny how that mentioned piece has not surfaced again, though. And this story stinks of inconsistencies and a lack of common sense. That's for sure. They don't even try to make it completely believable. At this point, if you're a veteran, you should be pretty concerned about the care that you receive at any VA facility that you go to. Now, there are some great facilities out there. There absolutely are. And there's great VA doctors, there's great VA staff. However, they're not all great. The facilities aren't all great. There's been plenty of headlines. I have a tracking document just filled with headlines of veterans getting abused, living in squalor in a VA facility, unsanitary conditions, unethical treatment, drunk doctors, sexual abuse, etc., etc., etc. But each article pushes a previous article that much further down the trail, so that way you forget about it. Now, the Kansas City Star published an article exposing the VA surgeon who is now banned from the operating room while his surgeries at a VA facility is under review. Now, apparently this physician had disciplinary actions against him for doing robot-assisted surgeries beyond his knowledge and abilities. Those surgeries, which took 3 times as long to accomplish as those who were actually qualified to do those surgeries with robotics, resulted in deadly complications for the patients. The investigation was from the Missouri's Board of Registration for the Healing Arts. The kicker in this is that the surgeries, what he was not qualified or experienced to use robots for, was while he worked in the Independence Hospital in 2012 and 2013. His actions caused the deaths of 1 woman and 2 severe complications for 2 other men who had prostate surgery. Only now is the VA banning him from being allowed to conduct surgery. So once again, does not give veterans the warm and fuzzy that the VA is hiring the most qualified, because it's clear that the VA does not conduct research into the background of their physicians, or staff for that matter. So think about that, because this doctor was a civilian doctor and caused the injuries and deaths of others, goes to work for the VA. He should have never been hired if he had that on his record, and yet he was hired and ends up hurting even more. So now he's barred from the operating room. That doesn't say that the VA barred him from actually practicing medicine. He just can't operate at this point while an investigation is ongoing. And that's very bothersome right there, because how many other doctors are the same same thing. So the Kansas City Star also published an article on the 1st of September exposing the doctor who was just banned from the operating room and was practicing at a Missouri hospital. So it's a supporting article that they had wrote previously, and then they updated it with more information. And that more information that he's barred because he was doing surgeries he wasn't qualified to do with technology, and it was taking him 3 times as long, which made it even worse for his patients. Now, NBC Boston announced that a Massachusetts VA nurse was stealing morphine from sick veterans at a Bedford, Mass. hospital. Kathleen Knopfel, 55, was arrested. She admitted that she deliberately diluted the morphine for patients and kept the remaining morphine. It was also exposed that one veteran in particular had issues breathing, and his suffering increased in the last days alive due to the diluted morphine. The VA director at the hospital had announced that this nurse was fired. So they were quick to say she was fired. This same nurse had resigned from a nurse position from a previous hospital for wasting narcotics on 60 occasions. So she had worked at another hospital and resigned as a nurse because she got caught wasting narcotics on 60 occasions. So my very first question that should be asked is, how, with that track record from a previous hospital, was this nurse allowed a position within the Veteran Affairs? Probably the same way the West Virginia serial killer was, same as the surgeon who was using robotics that I just mentioned, same as the drunken doctor who had misdiagnosed over 3,000 veterans, etc., etc., etc. So it's just showing you a pattern, a VA pattern, that they're just going to keep doing what they want to do, and automatically in their decisions. This tells me that they already factor in, hey, if we hire this person, there's a possibility that X number of veterans could die because of it. And they're okay with that. Why? Because they're making 6 figures and a fat bonus. So that should sit real well with the veteran community. All right, the Washington Post published their article explaining further what the Air Force veteran who was dying of cancer and was covered in ants, what he went through in a VA care facility in Georgia. The article furthers that VA directors was placed on administrative leave, which usually means the person gets paid. Despite his lack of management abilities and responsibilities, he was still allowed to keep getting his pay while he's on admin leave. The VHA executive in charge, Richard Stone, wrote a statement stating, see, once again, this is the VA's damage control efforts. Quote, "What happened at Eagle's Nest was unacceptable, and we want to ensure that veterans and families now know we are determined to restore their trust in the facility," end quote. Now, notice that the trend of immediate statements by VA officials after something bad is exposed. How quick they are to state that, we're going to be transparent and accountable and we're going to hold people accountable, but they don't. They never do. So the another article included more of Richard Stone's statement, which read, transparency, so quote, "Transparency and accountability are key principles at the VA, and we will guide our efforts in this regard," end quote. So funny, transparent is not exactly the word I would use when describing the VA and how they do their business, for sure. An article in Military Times reports that the VA admits their debt collection system needs a lot of work because they estimate over $1 billion in annual overpayments to veterans, which they require back. The VA does little to care if they owe the veteran money, but if the veteran owes the VA money, they will harass the veteran until they get that back. They will garnish the disability check. They will do whatever is necessary. So for the average veteran out there that reads that and is angry, why is the VA overpaying? The VA is a large organization, and they get over their annual budget's over $200 billion annually, over $200 billion. So think about it. So the VA sits down in front of the Congressional Committee on Veterans Affairs during the budget meeting and says, this is why we need $220 billion this year. We're supporting this. This is where the money's going, this. So the committee approves it, slams their gavel and says, yep, you get $220 billion for your 2019 budget. Great. The VA walks away from the table, laughing all the way to the bank. Why are they laughing? Because what the politicians care to acknowledge is that if the VA overpays a veteran, the VA can use that overpayment as part of their budget assessment, their estimates. Now, when the VA gets that money back, nowhere will you see that money has been returned for the VA to apply into another area. So what you see is that the VA is showing, hey, this is showing you that we have no money left over. we are spending it on this, and this, and poor us, we need more money. Mind you, facilities are falling apart. Staff are constantly being recycled, and bad staff are kept around while whistleblowers are retaliated against when they're trying to expose bad things that are happening, and it's ultimately hurting veterans. But the VA spends their time and effort in retaliating and abusing veterans and their situation. And case in point, I'm over 13 years now. I've been battling the VA, and it's almost become a very nasty game to them, and they're making it known that they have the power. So rather than me get on my soapbox on what they're doing to me at this point, think about when they're talking about, hey, we've overpaid veterans in the sum of $1 billion. Well, when they get that $1 billion back, where's it go? Well, what are they doing with it? Yeah, it'd be nice to have transparency to see exactly what staff member received what monetary bonus. Because I had previously published an article actually exposing what the money was, where it went, as far as what they put in their budget for bonuses, and what that would mean if every VA staff member were to receive a bonus, which doesn't happen. Everybody that works at the VA does not receive a bonus. And if they do, it's going to be a weighted bonus. So I know that they don't all receive a bonus. However, if in the strange world they were to receive a bonus, there's no way they would receive equal bonuses. So think about that. That money has to go somewhere, and it does. It's going to go into somebody's pocket. Once again, getting rich off the misery of veterans. So that's always nice. So connectingvets.org article regarding the VA staffing issues highlights how the VA admits they cannot afford to pay for quality physicians because in the civilian sector, the physicians would make twice as much that the VA could offer. Once again, shows that the VA is not concentrating on a solution to hire and retain quality help. Yet they're going to complain more that, well, we can't afford quality doctors, so it's not worth our time and effort, so we hire anybody we can get in there to fill the position, whether they qualify or not. Case in point, the nurse that got caught stealing morphine from veterans when she had actually resigned as a nurse previously in another hospital because of 60 infractions. Are you kidding me? And then she gets hired by the VA because that's what they can afford. Of course, they're not going to come out and say, well, that's all we can afford, because then they would need to be restructured. In other words, if I was a politician and I heard them come out with these lame excuses, I sure enough would be like, nope, you are now going to start restructuring. And this is how it's going to be laid out, as far as you need to make sure that your investments are in the physicians to provide veterans with proper care, and demand to see actions. Now, here's a case in point on why I say this. I watched the VA Committee on Veterans Affairs on YouTube when they had their committee session on budgets, and the committee demanded from Secretary McDonald at the time that the electronic health record application no longer be a proprietary application that was created by the VA, because the VA created that software and then created a department of IT guys to maintain it. But that application wouldn't talk to other applications. So in other words, DoD couldn't access VA records of veterans. So if a veteran who's on TRICARE goes to a clinic on base, that clinic cannot access that veteran's healthcare record because those two applications wouldn't talk. Now, honestly, from a common sense standpoint, does that make any level of sense whatsoever? To have an application that is for housing medical records of the veterans who could possibly go use TRICARE because that's what's closer for them, because in some locations a VA facility is not close. So they go to a clinic because it's closer, like a military clinic. But then that's their right under TRICARE, is to actually see these physicians. Or what about a hospital or a civilian doctor who is their primary care provider, because some veterans don't want to go to the VA for care. And after these headlines, I understand why. But the VA had their own application and they were just pouring money into it. To me, it seemed more like laundering money, but right on. So this committee demanded that the VA come up with an off-the-shelf solution so it can talk to the DoD, it can talk to other facilities, so that way it's easier for the veteran. And the VA said, we're working on it. Now, this was years ago. And each year they would show how much money they were losing because they were working towards it, but they haven't come up with a solution. And recently, it was like a year ago, that the VA turns around and says, the VA secretary shows that, well, we gave X business millions of dollars, and at the end of the contract said it was too hard, we couldn't figure out a solution, but yet still paid that organization millions of dollars to try to produce something that they couldn't do. These are the shady dealings that need to be investigated. Now, the Orlando Sentinel wrote an article further maintaining that the VA stance that the politicians must leave their hospital, as far as that office goes, by December 2019. And the VA secretary is holding his ground, trying to put out that the VA needs that space to expand veteran care, and the politicians are trying to hold their ground, but only because they want to be close to the veterans, but the VA needs that space. So I'm going to keep an eye on that and keep updating people on how that's transpiring there. Military Times reported that veteran suicides increased despite the VA's attempt at mental health care solutions. Once again, the VA showing, hey, we need more money to apply towards veteran suicide prevention and so on and so forth. But what was published was the 2019 annual report on veteran suicide at the VA, and the cover letter from Dr. Stone from VHA. Yeah, it's a nice letter that states, we're all about pursuing help for veterans and reduce veteran suicide. You start looking at the stats, because an article came out today that I published about veteran suicide and how the VA is failing on that front. And yet they're still getting funding for veteran suicide. 60,000 veterans have committed suicide in the last 10 years. But every year the VA asks for more money to combat it. So what does that show you? That the VA cares? No, it shows you that the VA knows they can ask for money because it's a hot ticket item for politicians to try to reduce veteran suicide. And yet the numbers increase, which shows you that they're not successful. Any organization that runs a project like that starts seeing a loss, they determine whether or not to cut their losses and stop with their pursuit in that avenue to figure out a more successful route. They don't keep pouring millions of dollars into a go nowhere solution. An organization that's successful does not do that. So keep that in mind when you start seeing this pity me and we need more money because our current funding is not enough. I call BS on that. So the ConnectingVets.radio article on the rise of suicides since 2017 is pretty interesting. WSFA, they announced a new director will be put in place while former director is allowed to retire. That's right, allowed to retire and receive pension despite the failures under her watch. Yep. So instead of holding her accountable and bringing her under charges and making her, get what's owed to her because of the abuse that she allowed happen under her watch. Nope, instead she gets to retire, so she gets a pension and she gets to disappear. And there's a similar story that occurred a handful of years ago with the VA lawyer who did the same thing, had a veteran charity and took all the money, kept all the money to himself. As soon as it was exposed, Secretary McDonald's, within 5 days, in the headlines, shaking this guy's hand, congratulating him and retiring him immediately. So that way the VA can distance themselves from it and say, oh, we didn't know what was going on. Yeah, no, that shows you what we have to deal with, folks. That's what veterans get to deal with daily. And yet everybody thinks hunky-dory, best medical care in the world. No, it's not. No, it's not. Because we have to deal with cancerous staff like that and have to wonder if we're going to survive our physical appointment. So that's every time. Nice, huh? Not only that, but we get to battle for our appeals decades after decades. So the Montgomery Advisor published an article saying the director is allowed to retire, replacement put in place while the deputy director and associate director have been reassigned. So the number 1, number 2, and number 3 personnel aren't going to be held accountable. The director is allowed to retire and the number 2 and number 3 person gets reassigned. They don't get a reduction in pay, they get reassigned, showing that the VA's expanding track record of retiring those who have been exposed for the wrongdoing or relocating them to another position with the same pay or higher pay, or another location with the same pay, plus their travel expenses paid for, and no one gets held accountable. And eventually you're going to forget about that story as well, too, because that's what happens. That's how they bury stories. Stars and Stripes published an article. VA is now claiming 17 veteran suicides per day because now they adjusted their data to omit data from service members, National Guard, and reserve members who were never federally activated from the data count. So they further that 2.5 suicides daily in 2017 amongst National Guard and reserve members in the state, and state the DoD should report on the active duty suicides. The only reason the VA is doing this is to make them look like the veteran suicide overall number is less. Because as today's article that I published states, 60,000 veterans. So they have increased daily, not decreased. And yet these periodicals are trying to push that, hey, the VA is claiming now that they got victory because it's 17 a day. It's not really 20 a day or 22 a day. It's actually 17 a day. And that's only because they're manipulating the data. So that way it makes them look like they're making forward progress. And if anyone can guess, I bet you're thinking, I wonder if that's so they can ask for even more money because they're saying what they're doing now is successful. I would have to think just like that. So Military Times published article, politicians are pandering to their followers by pointing fingers and blaming other politicians for their lack of leadership abilities. Our politicians are failing miserably and care little about those affected by their lack of efforts. And it's easy for the Democrats to blame Trump, especially since they make no efforts to support anything he does. This causes Republicans to blame Dems, and then they bicker back and forth and nothing gets done. So they basically threaten each other, and defense budget can't be passed, and military could be out of money again. So think about it, because they're getting their money. These politicians get their money. So that now they're proposing an extension so the military can get paid up to the 21st of November. This is all trying to be rushed so they can all go on their little vacation. So you see what they did there? Throw a huge issue onto the air, threaten that bad things are going to happen if they don't take action, then propose something that makes it look like they're actually caring by granting an extension so people can get paid. So let's not forget that these people are making $174,000 at a minimum per year plus $3 million in an annual budget for staff and travel. Yeah, they're not going to go hungry at all. So they're willing to allow our military to jump on those grenades and our veterans to not receive a disability check when most of those veterans are relying on that just to survive, while they go on vacation to a nice location where they can spend their money, their time, and be stress-free. It's awful nice. I think veterans should have that ability to be able to go on vacation, to be stress-free from VA cares and worries. But as long as the VA keeps operating the way it does, then that's never going to happen. So West Virginia News published an article, West Virginia politicians are pushing for Congress to hold hearings before federal investigations are complete. The Republican representative from West Virginia, Capito, thinks a hearing should take place with the VA and the VA-OIG. I have a feeling that will not occur because the VA and the VA-OIG will not want their words to become public record because they could be held to that, which I can sort of understand because I would want the investigation to be done fully before I start testifying so that way all the facts are right in front of you and can't be manipulated by the press or anything else. So as long as that data is true and not manipulated, in other words, made up, then I can understand it. However, 2018, the first veteran was killed by insulin injection when they weren't diabetic. And now 5 are confirmed. And they're trying to reach out to more families because they think the number initially, when they thought it was going to be 12 overall, is going to be expanding. So automatically 5 tells you it was a serial murder. And yet still no names are mentioned and people are not being put on blast as to what departments, who's involved, so on and so forth. The Sentinel Record published an article saying Senator John Boozman is stating that he has been trying to make efforts to reduce the veteran suicide rate nationally, but also makes remarks in this write-up that should be noticed more instead of being breezed over, such as, quote, Congress is working to change the statistics. Over the last 10 years, we've nearly quadrupled the VA's funding for suicide prevention efforts, end quote. Let that sink in, folks. 10 years. Yet that suicide number has not changed. The article furthers that the community should do more, the VSOs should do more, and private organizations should do more, yet does not ping on the fact that the VA has progressively gained more money each year to do more by the billions. Yet their attempts are not reducing the veteran suicide rate, and no one questions a decade of failed programs. So the VA is being allowed to sit there and point fingers and say, well, the community needs to do more. They need to come together. The community is not getting paid to reduce veteran suicide. VSOs, as much as I have a tarnished opinion of these VSOs today, are not paid to do more. These money, the funding that they get from Congress, is for the VA to do more. Now, the Eagle posted an article states that the VA secretary put out a new press release regarding veteran suicide, and it states, ironically enough, quote, I encourage everyone to take a moment and be there for veterans in need. One act of thoughtfulness can make a big difference and may even save a life, end quote. Now, this is ironic because the Secretary will not confront VA abusers, won't fire those exposed for harming or killing veterans, and proceed to relocate other cancerous staff instead of firing them. The VA continues to deny appeals, delay applications, conveniently lose FOIA requests and letters of proof, and send veterans to clinicians bought and paid for by the VA who manipulate the reports to favor the VA while the veteran gets blindsided. So I find it ironic that the Secretary will actually come out and say this when they will not embrace why veterans chose to kill themselves in an act of suicide on VA property. And I think that will illuminate a lot exactly why veterans kill themselves when they don't feel they have any other alternative and are tired of the pain, the daily pain of having to deal with the VA, their physical pain, their lack of support, their abusive treatments, so on, and nowhere to turn. So once they get to the point of hopelessness, then they make the decision to kill themselves. I mean, think about it. The majority of the veterans killing themselves, which isn't public knowledge as far as it's not being put out in the periodicals, are Vietnam-aged veterans. You know, these people that have been suffering from Agent Orange exposure or PTSD from the Vietnam War, and they're getting brushed aside. And I think that's a horrible thing. Now, the CBC, which is a Canadian publication, had published an article which it's nice that a politician in Canada who's running for office is stating he's going to confront the veteran backlog and deficiencies in Canada, as well as pushing for an investigation into mefloquine, which should have already occurred, yet does not seem to be a hot topic item in Canada, or the US for that matter. And mefloquine is still being used today, and the market report comes out each week on its position, and specifically in Canada. Now, mefloquine is an anti-malarial drug that we had to take when we were in service, and there's long-term effects that are now being seen. They call it quinism, that affects the veterans system and is a horrific thing, but nobody's embracing that. And I mean, we all know in the military, we're guinea pigs. We are. We know we're getting shots. We know we're going to be getting used for certain data. And it's not that we're one with it, but you kind of deal with it. So I'm not saying it's right, but what I am saying is it's nice that this politician's actually coming out saying, hey, I'm going to be looking into this and we're going to do an investigation into mefloquine. However, I don't foresee him winning just because he made that statement. Seriously. So it's going to be tried. Because if he gets office and he does do this, think about what it's going to affect. And big pharmacy is part of that. So Task and Purpose posted an article. Between 2008 and 2017, 60,000 veterans committed suicide despite the VA receiving millions upon millions of dollars over and above their over $200 billion annual budget, only to have no impact on veteran suicide. So what does the VA say to that? We need to work harder and more programs to combat this problem. That's what they say. That's what the VA says. Not, we failed. We did this. We wasted this amount of money thinking it was going to work, but the data didn't provide. And they're not going to say that. And the reason why they're not going to say that, because someone with common sense would turn around and say, why did you continue dropping money into that avenue if it was not producing positive results? So that's why they stay away. That's why the VA stays away from making those kind of statements, especially in front of a Congressional Senate Committee of Veterans Affairs. AJC published an article, VA put over 500,000 veterans at risk by prescribing opioids without first checking to see if those veterans already had concurrent opioid prescriptions from other doctors. This report was from the VA OIG. It was exposed that the VA employees failed to check the state prescription database prior to prescribing the opioids over 70% of the time, which equaled over 107,000 prescriptions. So right there tells you that they're not training staff. They're not employing staff or paying staff enough for them to care enough to actually do the research that's needed. Now, I'm not saying opioids are bad. What I'm saying is there's always going to be people that abuse that system because they enjoy being high or whatever high it gives them, while the rest of us that have to take opioids to actually function throughout the day do not abuse our medications. But it needs to be known that some veterans actually do remain proactive and make sure that they don't get prescribed something over and above what they shouldn't be prescribed, at least if they're responsible. Granted, some veterans will do whatever's necessary to scam the system. But I had seen a civilian doctor years ago, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Are you still being seen by the VA?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, then I can't prescribe you anything." And I said, "Well, I don't understand. I mean, I need a fallback because the VA was delaying medical or pain meds, and I was getting dicked over pretty hard." And I was like, I need a kind of a plan B. I need to fall back. Hence why I brought you my medical records. And he's like, "No, I can't. Either you use me or you use the VA, but you can't use both." And I understood it. So I didn't, stomp my feet out there and get my feelings hurt, because I actually understood. And that's kind of a good policy to have, because you see that veterans are willing to go to the VA and say, "Oh, I need my pain meds," and not tell the VA doctor or staff that they're already receiving opioids from a civilian doctor. So for those veterans who are scamming the system, yeah, I only have, 2 words for you, and that's screw you. I'll make it 3 words. Screw you, hippie. Because we used to call them Blue Falcons when we were in the service, because that's exactly what they are. Now, The Hill, this is one of the articles that I published today as well, had published an article saying veterans today, they're fearful of using medicinal marijuana or any marijuana to try to see if it'll ease their chronic pain, because if the VA tests them with a blood test or urine test and it comes back hot that they have THC in their system, the VA will not prescribe them medication after that. So it doesn't behoove the veteran to actually reach out and see if a CBD combination will actually work for their pain, so they can try to reduce their amount of pain meds. The VA uses that as, well, it's class 1, which means it's on the same class as heroin and LSD because it's abusive. And what else did they say? That there's no medical benefit that could be backed up, which makes me pretty sad, because there has been tests and it has shown that it helps with chronic pain by the science. So if I was trying to find if CBD or a combination of CBD and low levels of THC would work to replace my chronic pain meds, so that way my organs don't have to process the pain meds, it's going to be detrimental to me if I get a blood test and all of a sudden I pop hot. So I won't get the same support. But where are the politicians now fighting, saying, "Hey, I'm starting to receive these reports from veterans stating that, CBD oil or a low level THC, high concentration of CBD is actually helping these veterans get off opioid pain meds." And the reason why you don't hear these politicians pushing for that, I have a big feeling Big Pharma has a reason that is part of the reason that the politicians aren't pushing to have, medicinal marijuana tested and used by the VA. So the VA still falls back on it. Well, it's federally illegal, so we can't prescribe it or offer it to them, and we're not going to pay for it if they pursue it. But if they pop hot, we're sure enough going to screw them over. So it's nice to know that the VA is truly looking out for veterans. If there was a process or a plant that could help veterans and be much less of an impact on their internal organs, why wouldn't they want to pursue it? Money, 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 money. Finally, article from the Sacramento Bee. The VA intends on stripping California of its contract to regulate GI Bill benefits, denying California the power it used to investigate alleged abuses by for-profit colleges and to hand down sanctions. So the VA wants California to update their tracking on whether or not schools are being paid properly. There are definitely colleges and universities that take advantage of the federally funded GI Bill and the veterans, and it screws them over. And the universities got super greedy. And I can tell you from experience that there are some universities out there that care not about the student. They care about making that money. Hence why more colleges pop up to offer online degrees and so on and so forth, because it's an easier way for them to gain more funding while providing less product. So yeah, that now the VA is trying to strip California of their ability to assess whether or not the university is properly doing what they're supposed to be doing with the GI Bill. So I just mentioned a whole lot of articles, and the key factor to all of these is that you got to keep track of these headlines. And even though you're not going to, I am, because I want to make sure that veterans know exactly what's going on out there. Because if they don't, they're going to get blindsided, and then they're going to scream that they're the victim because nobody told them. Guess what? You want the information? Pursue the information. And I'll try to update everybody on the stories. But unfortunately, there's so many headlines, there's so many topics that it's hard to concentrate and research on just one, because there's not enough hours in the day. Okay? So keep listening. Keep talking to your veteran buddies. Tell them if they got a VA story, if they got a veteran story, good or bad. Love to do an interview with them. That way they could put out their information and get this information out to other people, because currently, right now, it does not look good for the veteran community. The VA is hiding cancerous staff. They're relocating them. They're retiring them in true VA fashion. Politicians are doing hands off. They're going to announce that they really want to do something about it, but then they retire or they leave office doing nothing about it. So that way they look like they're leaving with a bang, supporting their veterans. It's all smoke and mirrors, folks. It's all a game. So the goal is to be good enough at the game to not allow the game to fall on you. So hope everybody's safe, and be talking to you again soon.